Do you love the Tabernacle Choir? This year, the choir's music is everywhere you are. Listen to your favorite choir songs and music and the spoken word anytime you want on Alexa by simply enabling the skill.
Alexa, play music in the spoken word.
Now playing music in the spoken word.
You can also download the Tabernacle Choir app, subscribe to the choir on YouTube, listen on Spotify, and have access to all their wonderful music. Happy listening.
Joining us now, Christian Caple, writes on the University of Washington for On Montlake. Kind enough to hang out with us. Christian, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. How are you guys?
Always a pretty high bar there in Washington. What are the expectations on this year's team?
Yeah, I think after they went 8-4 last year, with 3 of those 4 losses coming to Ohio State, Michigan, and Oregon, the probably the 3 toughest games everybody could have circled preseason. I think the expectation is for them to be even more competitive against that caliber of opponent this year. They finished the year with back-to-back games against Indiana and Oregon. They go to USC. They go to Nebraska. They host Penn State. I think that those are kind of the caliber of game that folks have circled this year to see, like, in 2024 when they played Oregon and Penn State and Indiana and Iowa, they got blown out. And last year when they played Ohio State and Michigan and those types of programs, they were kind of in it a little bit longer. And I think folks this year are expecting them to win a game or two like that.
Devon Williams has generated a ton of national attention. What do you feel like he's got to do to take the next step?
Yeah, I mean, it goes hand in hand with the way that the whole team performed against some of their elite opponents. If you look at his numbers in a loss to Ohio State, to Michigan, to Wisconsin, and to Oregon, he was, he looked like a different player than he did in their 8 or 9 wins, which I guess is probably true of a lot of quarterbacks around the country if you look at how they play in wins versus losses. But you definitely saw, against elite defenses and, defenses that are loaded with blue chip recruits and NFL draft picks and a lot of speed. The processing probably wasn't quite where you'd want it to be. The decision making wasn't where you'd want it to be. There were a couple turnovers in those games that proved really crucial. Just a bad fumble here, a bad interception there. And so I think they're looking for him to still be the dual threat playmaker that he was for most of the season, but to clean things up against and maybe see things a little bit better and make better decisions against some of those better defenses they play.
Look, I know the dust has cleared a little bit, but are people still trying to figure out this Washington in the Big Ten kind of thing?
Yeah, I'd say so. I think, Jed Fish has spent a lot of time this offseason and really since he's been there talking about the financial piece of it and just what it's going to cost from a player compensation standpoint to put together a roster that can compete and win in the Big Ten. And they've recruited at a really high level. I know Jed Fish already is kind of talking about the bill that's going to come due in December or January if they want to retain all the young guys that they're going to be relying on this year that they expect to be high-level players. I think they could end up with this new 5-to-play-5 rule. They could end up in like the single digits as far as seniors who are actually exhausting their eligibility. So, they're going to have the vast majority of their roster eligible to return. And, they kind of are looking at what that's going to cost to keep all those guys back relative to the rest of the Big Ten. And then also from a personnel standpoint and a roster construction standpoint, they knew they had to get bigger in the trenches. They knew they had to, build depth there and try to build a team that physically looked like it belonged in the Big Ten for that style of play, which they feel like they're a lot closer to having this year.
One piece to replace, 7 draft picks last year, and wherever Jed Fish goes, man, there's talent, it seems like. But replacing Jonah Coleman will be a task. 4th-round pick to Denver. Your thoughts on the running game and who can step up and help replace him?
Yeah, that's really one of the few question marks as far as, who is going to take the first snap when the offense takes the field. Their personnel, their starting personnel is pretty set across the board other than running back and maybe one receiver spot and an offensive line spot. And, I think the coaching staff is very excited about and thinks very highly of Quade Carr, who's a second-year player from Servite High School in Anaheim. He was great in high school. He was a Trinity League MVP, I believe, who just kind of went under the radar in recruiting and was committed to San Diego State for a good while in the 2025 class before he flipped to Washington before signing day. And he's kind of got the speed and the quickness and the vision that they like there. They did, not just losing Jonah Coleman, but losing Adam Mohammed in the transfer portal to Cal. From the time he stepped on campus as a freshman in 2024, he kind of seemed like the heir apparent to Jonah Coleman after a couple of years, but he transferred, and so they went out and got Jaden Lamar, transfer from Oregon in the transfer portal, who's from around here, around the Seattle area originally, and folks here remember him as a four-star recruit and everything coming out of Lake Stevens High School, and so I think they're going to rely on him for some of those, and third downs and pass protection and some of those things that you would look more to a veteran for as far as in the running game.
Jedd Fisch and play calling, I know, has always been kind of an issue. Where does that stand? Is he still the primary play caller going into the season?
He is, yeah. So I think he'll do that as long as he's coaching, frankly. I don't think that's a responsibility that he ever wants to give up. They've retooled their offensive staff a little bit, whereas he'd had Jimmy Doherty on his staff for a while. He had the offensive coordinator title, but of course, Jedd Fisch has always been the play caller, and he coached the quarterbacks. He is out. They hired Matt Cavanaugh, a longtime NFL offensive coordinator, and former All-American himself as a quarterback at Pitt, to kind of be an offensive assistant as far as helping with game planning and situational stuff, and just sort of giving Jedd Fisch a different set of eyes, kind of, who hasn't coached with him and doesn't come from his system necessarily, and just, sort of a fresh perspective on certain things offensively. And he'll, I imagine, would also work a little bit with Damon Williams. J.P. Lossman was promoted to coach the quarterbacks, so they actually don't have a coach on staff with an offensive coordinator title this year.
Washington, in my mind, returns one of the better defensive cores in the conference too. Guys that can run and get after the quarterback, a secondary that can hold things down. Feel like this can be kind of the differentiator, the defense. You talked about the offensive explosiveness, but could this be the piece that vaults them into a possible championship game in terms of the league? Yeah,
I think their defense was pretty solid last year, and I think there's every expectation that they'll be a little bit better this season. They've turned over almost the entire interior D-line room, but I think they feel better about the talent there overall. Those guys look pretty good in the spring. I think they feel like they're deeper at edge rusher, although, they're going to need a guy or two to really step up and lead that pass rush. They weren't great at getting to the quarterback last year, and I think they have a pretty talented secondary, and Jedd Fisch and their defensive coordinator, Ryan Walters, and their linebackers coach have all talked about this linebacker group like it's one of the best that they've ever been around at the college level. And so I think they very much expect linebacker to be the strength of the team and feel like they're talented throughout. And, I think their defense gave them a chance against everybody last year. They did not give up more than 26 points in a game. And, I think that's going to be the case again this year. So, there are lots of questions still around, hey, who's going to be that big, physical down the field X receiver to replace Denzel Boston? What's the running game going to look like? And, can Damon Williams Jr. kind of take the next step against great defenses? And, I think that's going to kind of determine the ceiling for this team, because I think the defensive talent is pretty solid. And I think, having another year in Ryan Walters' system and having that continuity, and now having constructed that roster to his schematic preferences and everything, I think they're expecting big things out of that side of the ball.
So I should know this, but what is I know they're playing this year. Is there a long-term future in place for the Apple Cup, or is that kind of on pins and needles? And is there a desire from the Washington side to keep that rivalry going?
Make game day yours. Tickets, food and drinks, stats, and streaming. Everything you need is in the Utah Mammoth app. Download today and make game night easy. Download on both Android and iPhone. Tusk Top.
Yeah, it's up in the air. They signed a 5-year agreement beginning in 2024, so that goes through 2028. So there's at least 2 more coming after this year, both on campus. So Pullman in 2026 and Seattle in 2028. Pullman in 2027 and Seattle in 2028. And, I think so much is undecided about, future realignment and what are the leagues even going to look like and what's the league schedule going to look like and, what teams are you going to be, kind of required to play on an annual basis? What's the future of non-conference scheduling? Do you want to have some sort of SEC crossover if you're a Big Ten team? Do you want to have some sort of Power 4 round robin like Jed Fish has sort of talked about? I think there's too many variables for them to really know with any certainty right now. I think the higher up in the university and in the state you go, I think you have more willingness to kind of keep it going just as sort of a showcase for the state. And, hey, who wouldn't want Washington and Washington State to play each other every year, just, in a general sense. But, we'll kind of see what it looks like in the Pac-12 for Washington State and what makes sense for them too, right? I mean, if this is a program that's feels like it can be at the top of that league and compete for that league's championship and feels like, having a more manageable schedule in the non-conference gives them a better chance to maybe go undefeated and get into the playoff. And that's another factor, right? Is it going to expand to 24 teams or more than 12 at some point? And what's that going to look like for a league like the Pac-12? So I think so many things are still up in the air. It's pretty hard to forecast it out beyond the current through 2028.
Who's a name up there, a part of the team that, we haven't heard a ton about that we will? Somebody you feel like will make an impact that isn't necessarily somebody that's on anybody's radar.
Yeah, I mentioned him, but I would say Quade Carr at running back.
Okay.
I think the way that the coaching staff has talked about him, and also he was really of the main competitors for that job, and I guess for some share of reps there. He was the only guy who was healthy all spring. So he took a lot of the number one reps throughout the spring. And, Jaden Lamar is a veteran. He was recovering from an off-season surgery. He'll be back healthy. That's not really who spring practice is for anyway, right? But they brought in another veteran transfer, Trey Cooley, who I'm sure will get his opportunity there too. But I just in terms of Quade Carr is a guy that this staff recruited. They identified him. They liked what they saw from him in practices last year. I think would have liked to have gotten him going a little bit more late in the season, but he had a sprained ankle that sort of held him back. But he was healthy all spring. They loved what he did in the spring. I would not be surprised if he's their starter this year. And, I think they kind of see him as the guy, at least for 2026, who's probably got the highest ceiling.
So I know you touched on it a little earlier, but, if your wife comes home and says she's going to leave you, and then another day later she goes, I changed my mind. We're good, and I'm just going to hang out with you and the kids, and everything's going to be fine. There's still going to be a certain level of awkwardness in the house for a while. How has things been with Damon Williams since I'm going to leave? No, I'm coming back. Is that just water under the bridge, or is there still some lingering feelings there?
I think internally it's water under the bridge. College football is a pro sport now.
Yeah.
For better or worse, it's just the way it is. You took a poll of all the guys in that locker room. I would imagine most have agents, and most probably made their decision coming out of high school based on financial numbers that were put in front of them. Might not have been the most important thing for every guy, but it's at least a consideration. And, I think it's pretty well documented by now that the opportunity he was considering leaving for was going to pay him a couple million more dollars. And I think that guys that age are going to understand more than anybody that well, geez, if you put that much more money in front of me, I don't know what I would do either. Right. So I think if you're in that building, you understand it's a business and these things happen. And I think, the way that Jed Fish has kind of talked about it is, hey, lots of schools lost their quarterback and are starting over, and just focus on the fact that we didn't, right? So I think it's and understandably so a tougher thing for fans to get past, right? And so I think his performance early in the season is going to go a long way toward how people sort of look at that. But they had a spring game, they had fans out there. I don't know that I heard anybody booing him at the spring game, so. It all kind of just comes down to, do you win? Do you play well? And that tends to dictate how these things go.
Looking at the schedule, what are your thoughts on it? It looks like, a rivalry game right out of the gate, and Bronco Mendenhall is always a little sneaky. So those will be interesting games, but your just general thoughts about the schedule and how it lays out.
Yeah, it was real top heavy and bottom heavy for them in the Big Ten last year. So you mentioned Ohio State and Oregon and Michigan, but they also played, I think, 4 of the 5 Big Ten teams that didn't get bowl eligible. And you didn't really have that like middle, right? Every game was either an opponent you knew was going to be really tough, who you're probably going to be an underdog against, or a team that you should definitely beat. This year, the middle portion of the schedule, the could go either way portion of the schedule is a lot bigger. Like they go to USC on October 3rd. They're probably going to be underdogs there, but that's still going to be seen as a winnable game, or at least a game that they're going to have to win to stay in CFP contention through November. They host Iowa 6 days later, right? That's another tough game, but a game that you definitely would think they'd have a chance to win at home. They go to Nebraska, a very winnable game, but also not the easiest place to play on Halloween also, for whatever that's worth. And they host, a Penn State team that I think is a little bit in like wait and see, first year under Matt Campbell and new roster and everything. But it's still Penn State. And so that's a game that I'm sure Penn State will have an expectation to win, and Washington will have an expectation to win. So that sort of middle portion of the schedule is a lot bigger this year. Is the top third as tough as it was a year ago? Closing with the defending national champion and Oregon, a team that I think a lot of people are probably going to pick to be national champion or compete for it this year. That's really tough. You look at the first 10 games they play, and there's not a single one that you circle and go, oh, well, there's just no way they can win that game. But there are a bunch that they could certainly lose as well.
So hosting a show here in Salt Lake City when Utah got into the Pac-12, I guess we're looking at about 15 years ago, we got introduced to the teams around the Pac-12, and you know them and you watch them, but then when you actually cover them, you start to learn some things about them. And, the joke was always, USC, the University of Spoiled Children. But then there was a lot of people that we talked to said, hey, be careful about Washington fans, because USC fans may get the bad rap, but it's Washington fans that can be a little bit overzealous in their expectations for their team year in and year out. Is that a fair assessment? That sometimes the eyes get a little bigger than the stomach in terms of fans in Washington and what they expect out of their team every year?
Maybe a little bit. I think that the Don James era definitely instilled a different standard that the program has not often lived up to in the now, 30 plus years since. But at the same time, in 2016, they won the Pac-12 and made a 4-team college football playoff. In 2023, they won the Pac-12, went undefeated in the regular season, and made the national championship game. So the highs have been high enough that I think folks do have a certain expectation. And, you can go back and look at for a period of 30 years there, from the 80s through the early 2000s or whatever, average AP ranking and winning percentage and stuff. And, they were high enough and among sort of not the very upper class of college football, but enough that I think it instilled a reasonable expectation that they should win at a pretty decent clip. And so, I think it's a little bit of a recalibration going to the Big Ten, and, finishing 5th in the Pac-12 was never going to be seen as a good year, right? But if you finish 5th in this Big Ten, you probably had a pretty good season. Mm-hmm. It's the same idea that a lot of people are going to have to get used to if there ever is a super league, right? I mean, if you ever make a league of 24 or 32 of all the top brands in college football, somebody's going to have to go 4-8, who's used to 8-4 being a bad season. So I think there's a little bit of expectation reset necessary for the Big Ten, but also, they made the decision to leave the Pac-12 and go to the Big Ten, and they're paying their head coach more than they've ever paid a head coach, and everyone knows their starting quarterback's getting paid $4 million plus this year. And so there's, I think that being understood, there's a little bit of a, hey, go out and prove it.
So Utah State, I do the play-by-play for Utah State. They'll be up there early September. I'll hit you up for some, look, it's Seattle. You can't go wrong with any restaurants up there, I'm sure. But, trying to find a good solid list, I'll probably pick your brain a bit, okay?
Hey, I'm all for it. I live in Tacoma, so I might tell you to get in the car and head south a few miles. But
Well,
I guess you could find somewhere to eat in Seattle.
I mean, that's the thing. Like, I just don't want to get too touristy. You want to find the places that nobody really talks about that much. So there you go. Hey, well, we appreciate it. Thanks for your time. Looking forward to seeing you up there in September, and we'll talk again here very soon.
All right, thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Good stuff. Christian Caple, right here on 97.5, the KSL Sports Zone, covers the University of Washington on Montlake.